Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. Darkness had begun to fall over the landscape. The roadside trees, which had seemed so beautiful in the daylight breeze, now took on a ghostly appearance. However, ghosts were the furthest thing from Marcus's mind. He was accustomed to driving on deserted roads, finding comfort in the solitude, accompanied only by the sounds of birds or forest animals that happened to stray onto the road. Marcus had traveled this road so often that he knew it like the back of his hand. He had intended to start his journey during daylight, but by the time he excused himself from the meeting with a client, it was already twilight. Just to be on the safe side, he switched on Google Maps. Though he wasn't a fan of using maps for a path he knew well, it sometimes helped avoid traffic jams by suggesting alternate routes. At this hour, the road would be so deserted that there wouldn't be any humans for miles to assist him if he forgot the way. His decision to use maps paid off immediately, allowing him to bypass congested roads and exit the city in just 10 minutes. Normally, it would have taken half an hour to reach the highway. Once on the highway, Marcus kept the app running, but didn't need to check it since he knew the route well. He put on some music and settled in for the journey of a little less than 60 miles. He expected to be home in less than 2 hours, even after navigating the traffic in his hometown. The first sign of trouble appeared when he noticed that the distance to his hometown had increased from what it had been just a few minutes ago. He must have traveled at least 5 miles since he last looked at the maps. Deciding to ignore it, he assumed he had simply misread the distance earlier. He kept driving, but after about 10 minutes, he checked the remaining distance again. To his surprise, it had increased by 2 miles. It was now clear that he wasn't on the right road. He wondered how this could have happened. Perhaps he had relied too much on his own memory instead of Google Maps. Concerned, Marcus tried to spot familiar landmarks, but saw none. The entire road felt unfamiliar. The roadside eateries he was so used to seeing were nowhere in sight. The trees on both sides of the road looked different. He was frustrated with himself for getting lost on a road he had traveled so many times. Meanwhile, Google Maps continued giving him directions. He knew this wasn't the time to rely blindly on the software. The app wasn't as omniscient as it claimed to be. Maybe it hadn't mapped this part of the Earth correctly. He needed some human guidance. Although he had rarely felt scared in his life, fear was beginning to creep in. Just when he felt completely lost, Marcus saw a few people standing in the middle of the road. They seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, as the road had been deserted moments before. Still, he was thankful for their presence. He parked the car on the roadside and walked towards the group. The first thing he noticed about them was that they were all wearing the same kind of strange clothing. In the dim light, it appeared quite eerie. Since he had never encountered anything supernatural in his life, he didn't believe in ghosts. It was better to talk to someone than to stay lost. He checked his mobile. The distance to his home hadn't decreased much in the last 10 minutes of driving. As he approached the group, he realized they had yet to notice him. He tried to get their attention by walking closer. When they finally noticed him, they all looked at him with questioning eyes. Marcus explained his predicament and asked for directions to his hometown. For a moment, no one spoke. Disappointed, he took a step back towards his car. One of the men signaled for him to stop. The man began to speak, though his voice wasn't very clear. Marcus could still make out the words, "Many people get lost in this area at night, but don't worry, we'll guide you." He continued, "All of us had shops here before they were demolished by the government to widen the road. We were hopeful of getting good compensation since we lost our livelihoods." He paused, and for a moment, Marcus forgot he was lost and listened intently. The man looked at him as if trying to gauge his interest. Marcus nodded, encouraging the man to continue. "We tried to get compensation from the government, but everywhere we went, we were asked for bribes. We couldn't afford to pay as we had already lost everything. With no options left, we were forced to commit suicide." Marcus interjected, "Thank God you didn't go through with it." The man smiled enigmatically without saying a word. He changed the subject. "Okay, let's forget our problems. Go straight from here, and you'll find your way." Marcus looked at the man. Since he was lost, how could a straight road lead to his hometown? He got back into the car and rubbed his eyes to clear his vision. Thus, when he opened them, the road ahead was clear. He realized he had been too abrupt in returning to his car and had forgotten to thank the people who had helped him. He looked around, but there was no one on the road. How could they have disappeared so quickly? He shook his head, thinking that perhaps while he was rubbing his eyes, the people had walked off the road to their homes. He checked Google Maps to see the remaining distance. To his surprise, it now showed only 20 miles left. He was certain that when he had stepped out of the car to talk to those people, the app had been showing 50 miles. The road also looked familiar for the first time. He knew this road very well. Deciding to put the strange encounter and the confusion about the distance out of his mind, Marcus continued driving. He was home within 45 minutes. Later, he searched the internet and discovered that many similar incidents had occurred on that road. The same group of people had miraculously appeared to guide lost travelers. However, according to the information, there were no human habitations near that road. As he searched further, he found an old news item. The news had been sensational at the time, reporting that several people who had lost their roadside shops had committed suicide after their compensation was delayed by government officials, who demanded bribes under various pretexts. Their suicides led to the immediate settlement of their claims, with the money going to their families, but it was of no use to those who had died. It was a story that had been passed down among the students at Eldridge University, whispered during late-night study sessions and around campfires. The tale of the Phandom of Ashwood Pass was one of those legends that grew with each retelling, becoming a rite of passage for those daring enough to recount it. But for Rachel, it wasn't just a story. It was a chilling account shared by her older sister, Emily, who had lived through the ordeal. Emily had always been a practical woman, the kind who faced life's challenges with a steady hand and a calm demeanor. But even she couldn't have predicted what awaited her on that fateful journey back to Eldridge after the birth of her first child. Emily had traveled to her mother's home in the remote village of Ashwood, nestled deep within the mountains, to give birth and recover in the peace and quiet of the countryside. Now, with her baby girl Lily, 6 months old, it was time to return to the city and resume life with her husband, David. David, ever the planner, had arranged for a comfortable car and a trusted driver to ensure that Emily and Lily would have a safe and smooth journey back to Eldridge. The trip was expected to take around 8 hours, winding through the dense forests and treacherous roads of Ashwood Pass. Emily, who had made the journey countless times before, wasn't concerned. She looked forward to being home, to reuniting with David, and to starting their new life as a family of 3. They set out late one afternoon, the sky still bright with the remnants of the day. Emily and Lily settled into the back seat, with Emily watching the familiar scenery pass by as the driver navigated the winding roads. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, and Emily dozed off, lulled by the gentle motion of the car. As dusk gave way to night, the atmosphere in the car grew tense. The driver, a local named Henry, who had been recommended by Emily's mother, seemed increasingly nervous. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as they entered the heart of Ashwood Pass, a stretch of road notorious for its sharp turns and steep cliffs. The further they went, the more isolated they became, with the dense forest closing in on either side and the road ahead lit only by the car's headlights. It was just after midnight when the car began to slow down unexpectedly. Emily, who had been sleeping lightly with Lily nestled against her, stirred and glanced out the window. The car had come to a near stop, and Henry's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice thick with sleep. Henry didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on something up ahead. David, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, woke up and leaned forward to see what had caught the driver's attention. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a lone figure, a woman dressed in a flowing white gown, her long dark hair cascading down her back. She stood completely still, her back to the car, bathed in the eerie glow of the headlights. "What in the world?" David muttered, his voice trailing off. Henry finally found his voice, though it was shaky and filled with dread. "We can't go any further," he whispered. That's the Phantom of Ashwood Pass." "The what?" Emily asked, now fully awake and alert. She had heard stories about haunted places, but she had never given them much thought. Ghosts, spirits, and phantoms were things of folklore, tales spun by superstitious minds, but there was no mistaking the fear in Henry's eyes. "There are stories," Henry continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stories of a ghost that haunts these roads. They say she's the spirit of a woman who died here many years ago. Some say she was a bride who was killed on her wedding night. Others say she was a mother who lost her child. But whatever she was in life, now she's something else, something that shouldn't be." Emily exchanged a glance with David, who was clearly unnerved by the driver's words. But Emily, ever the pragmatist, wasn't about to let some ghost story delay their journey. "It's just a woman," she said firmly. "Probably some local playing a prank or someone lost on these roads. We need to keep moving." But Henry shook his head vehemently. "No, ma'am. I've heard too many tales about this road, and I'm not driving past her. It's bad luck, and there's no other way through this part of the mountain." Emily could feel the frustration building inside her. They were already tired from the journey, and Lily was beginning to stir in her arms, sensing her mother's tension. The idea of turning back was not an option. She looked at the figure again, standing eerily still, and then back at Henry, who was paralyzed with fear. "Fine," she said, her voice tinged with irritation. "I'll handle this myself." Before David could stop her, Emily unbuckled her seatbelt and carefully got out of the car, Lily still cradled in her arms. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped onto the dark road. The mountains loomed on either side, their peaks hidden in the darkness. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft hum of the car's engine. David called out to her, his voice laced with concern, but Emily didn't turn back. She walked purposefully towards the figure, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. As she drew closer, the woman began to turn, her movements slow and deliberate. Emily's heart raced, but she pushed the fear aside. She was determined to get them through this. When the woman finally faced her, Emily saw that her face was obscured by her long hair, her features hidden in the shadows. For a brief moment, Emily felt a cold chill run down her spine, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. But she wasn't about to let fear take hold. "Hey!" she called out, her voice strong and commanding. "What do you think you're doing, standing in the middle of the road like this? People have places to be." The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, as if she were studying Emily. That was the last straw. Without a second thought, Emily reached out and delivered a sharp slap across the woman's face. The sound echoed through the pass, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The woman recoiled, a look of shock crossing her features. Emily, not missing a beat, continued, "Get lost. Go find somewhere else to play your games and stop bothering travelers." To Emily's astonishment, the woman didn't argue or fight back. Instead, she turned and began to walk away, her figure retreating into the shadows. She moved towards a narrow dirt path that wound its way up the mountain, disappearing into the darkness without a trace. Emily stood there for a moment, watching until the woman was completely out of sight. Then, with a sigh of relief, she turned and walked back to the car. David and Henry were staring at her in disbelief, their mouths agape. "Let's go," Emily said, sliding back into the seat. "We've wasted enough time." Henry, thoroughly embarrassed and clearly shaken by the encounter, started the car and resumed the journey. The rest of the drive through Ashwood Pass was uneventful, though the atmosphere in the car was heavy with the tension of what had just transpired. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but she was too tired to dwell on it. All she wanted was to get home, put Lily to bed, and forget about the whole ordeal. They arrived in Eldridge in the early hours of the morning. David, still reeling from the night's events, couldn't stop talking about it. "Can you believe that? A ghost, or whatever it was, just standing there in the middle of the road, and you just slapped her." Emily chuckled, though it was a nervous laugh. "I don't know what she was, but I wasn't about to let her scare us. We had to get home, and she was in the way." But as the days passed, Emily couldn't help but think back to that moment on the road. She found herself searching for answers, driven by a nagging curiosity. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, she sat down at her computer and began researching the legend of Ashwood Pass. What she found sent a shiver down her spine. The stories about the pass were numerous, dating back decades. The most common tale was of a young woman named Evelyn, who had lived in Ashwood over 50 years ago. She had been a bride-to-be, set to marry a man from Eldridge, but tragedy struck on the night before her wedding. Evelyn had been traveling through Ashwood Pass with her fiancé when their car skidded off the road and plunged down a ravine. Her fiancé survived the crash, but Evelyn didn't. Her body was never recovered, and her spirit was said to haunt the pass, searching for the life she had lost. Emily's hands trembled as she read through the old newspaper clippings and online forums filled with accounts from other travelers who had encountered the phantom. Some described seeing a woman in white standing by the road, just as Emily had. Others spoke of strange occurrences, cars breaking down, eerie noises, and unexplained sightings. But none of the stories ended like hers. Disturbed by what she had learned, Emily confided in Rachel, who was equally unsettled by the story. "Do you think it was really her? That woman? Do you think she was Evelyn?" Rachel asked, her voice hushed as if speaking the name might summon the ghost. Emily didn't know what to believe. Part of her wanted to dismiss the whole thing as a bizarre encounter with a prankster or someone mentally disturbed. But another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something beyond explanation. As time went on, Emily tried to move past the experience, focusing on her family and her work. But the story of the Phantom of Ashwood Pass stayed with her, a lingering presence in the back of her mind. And though she never told David or anyone else, she found herself avoiding the pass on future trips, opting for the longer, safer routes, just in case. The legend of Ashwood Pass continued to grow, with Emily's encounter becoming yet another chapter in its haunted history. Travelers still spoke of the ghostly figure in white, warning others to be careful on those dark, winding roads. But those who knew the truth, the ones who had heard Emily's story, couldn't help but wonder, was it just a woman playing a cruel trick, or had Emily come face to face with something far more sinister, something that still haunted the shadows of Ashwood Pass? Jacinto Borja Street in Tagbilaran City had always been a bustling artery, connecting the life and soul of the city with its quiet residential neighborhoods. Yet for all its daytime activity, Borja Street was a place most residents avoided after dark. The road had earned a sinister reputation, whispered about in hushed tones among the locals. It wasn't just the ghostly stories tied to the ancient school at the corner of CPG Avenue or the chilling atmosphere that seemed to cling to the vicinity like a fog. The real source of dread lay in the two massive trees that loomed over the road like silent sentinels. The first tree stood at the Galaris end of the street, its gnarled roots clawing into the earth as if anchoring some ancient curse. The second tree, equally imposing, guarded the entrance to the Holy Spirit School near the intersection with CPG Avenue. These trees were more than just towering landmarks. They were believed to be gateways to another world, a realm where restless spirits roamed and dark forces held sway. Generations of Tagbilaran residents had shared stories of eerie encounters along this stretch of road. Some spoke of ghostly apparitions seen lurking near the trees, their hollow eyes following late-night travelers with an unblinking stare. Others claimed to have heard disembodied whispers, faint but insistent, urging them to turn back, to avoid the trees at all costs. It was said that the trees were home to spirits who had met tragic ends, their souls bound to the very earth from which the trees had sprung. One particularly unsettling tale involved a young man named Noli, who had grown up hearing stories about the haunted trees but had never paid them much mind. One evening, after a long night of drinking with friends, Noli decided to take a shortcut through Borja Street. He was alone, his footsteps echoing eerily in the quiet night as he approached the first tree. As he passed beneath its wide branches, a sudden chill swept over him, causing the hair on the back of his neck to stand on end. Noli quickened his pace, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He could hear the rustling of leaves above him, though the night was still. Glancing back over his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of something pale and indistinct, moving among the branches. Fear surged through him, and he broke into a run, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of his home, where he collapsed in a trembling heap. The next morning, Noli awoke with a fever. His mother, alarmed by his condition, called a local healer, who performed a ritual to cleanse him of any malevolent spirits that might have latched onto him during the night. As Noli recovered, he recounted his experience to his friends, who nodded knowingly. "You shouldn't have gone near the trees," they told him. "They don't like to be disturbed." In the years that followed, Noli avoided Borgia Street whenever possible, and the story of his encounter became another chapter in the growing legend of the haunted trees. But the question remained, were the trees truly cursed, or were they merely ancient witnesses to the countless tragedies that had unfolded along that dark road? The rain had been relentless that evening, a torrential downpour that turned the unpaved streets of Tagbilaran into rivers of mud. My aunt, who had been bedridden for weeks, was in desperate need of medical attention. My grandparents, fearing the worst, decided to take her to the community hospital in the town center, despite the storm. They wrapped her in a thick blanket to keep her warm, shielding her frail body from the cold. Two of her cousins hurried to the street, flagging down a tricycle to transport her to the hospital. The driver, a seasoned local who had navigated the city's streets in all conditions, quickly loaded her into the cab. With the cousins squeezed beside her, and her driver eager to complete the journey, they set off down Galara Street, turning left onto Jacinto Borja. The tricycle sped through the rain, its headlight slicing through the darkness, but as they neared the first massive tree at the Galara's end of Borja Street, disaster struck. A corner of my aunt's blanket had slipped out of the cab and was caught in the vehicle's wheel. In an instant, she was yanked from the sidecar, her body flung into the undergrowth behind the tree. The cousins screamed in horror, yelling at the driver to stop. They scrambled out of the tricycle, but the storm was in full fury, the rain falling in sheets, making visibility nearly impossible. The tree loomed over them, its thick branches swaying in the wind as if mocking their panic. For nearly an hour they searched the area, their voices hoarse from calling her name, but there was no sign of my aunt. The thick shrubbery and the darkness swallowed her whole. Defeated and drenched, the cousins reluctantly called off the search. They returned home, their hearts heavy with dread, fearing the worst. But when they arrived the next morning to resume the search in daylight, they were greeted by a crowd gathered near the base of the second tree in front of the Holy Spirit School, a few hundred meters away. The tricycle driver, who had returned to help, stood silently by, his face ashen. There, lying motionless in the shadow of the second tree, was my aunt. Her body was cold, her eyes staring blankly at the heavens. She had not been found where she had fallen, but had somehow ended up near the second tree, a distance too far to have been dragged by the wind or the storm. Whispers spread through the crowd, tales of the haunted trees, and the belief that her body had been moved by something or someone not of this world. For years, my family avoided discussing that night. The tragedy was too painful, the questions too unsettling, but the rumors persisted, growing with each retelling. The trees were said to be cursed, the spirits of the dead moving through them like shadows, pulling the living into their world. My aunt's death became another ghost story, a cautionary tale for those who dared to walk Borgia Street after dark. Yet, as I grew older, I began to question the supernatural explanations. What if my aunt had survived the fall? What if, dazed and injured, she had somehow crawled her way towards the hospital, only to collapse in front of the second tree, just short of help? The thought haunted me, a rational but no less terrifying possibility. Whether it was ghosts or the cruel hand of fate, one thing was certain. The shadow of Borgia Street, with its ancient trees and tragic history, would forever linger over my family. In the small, tight-knit community of Ravens Creek, legends and ghost stories are as common as the rolling hills and dense forests surrounding the town. Among these legends, the tale of the haunted bridge of Ravens Creek is perhaps the most infamous, a story that has been passed down through generations, growing more chilling with each retelling. The bridge, an old, creaky structure spanning the dark, sluggish waters of the Ravens Creek River, had been a local landmark for decades. Built in the early 1900s, it was a vital crossing point between two parts of the town. But as with many old bridges, it came with its own set of eerie stories. None, however, were as unsettling as the one that unfolded one fateful night. It was a crisp autumn evening when Tom, a high school senior, and his girlfriend Sarah decided to take Tom's old Jeep out for a drive. The two teenagers, both 18 and deeply in love, were in the midst of a heated argument, their voices raised and emotions raw. Tom had been drinking that night, a fact that had already caused tension between the couple. Their argument had escalated, and in a fit of frustration, Tom sped down the winding road leading to the bridge. The bridge was notorious for its sharp turns and narrow lanes, and Tom's impaired judgment made the drive treacherous. As they approached the bridge, Tom's reckless driving reached its peak. The Jeep skidded on the wet road, the tires screeching as he lost control. The vehicle careened off the edge of the bridge and plunged into the murky waters below. The impact was devastating. The Jeep sank quickly, the water rushing in through the open windows. Tom managed to scramble out of the driver's side and clamber up to the surface, gasping for air. But in his panic and disorientation, he did not even attempt to save Sarah, who was still trapped inside the sinking vehicle. The bridge was soon covered in a thick mist, and by the time the local authorities arrived, it was too late. Sarah's body was never recovered from the river, and Tom was left to deal with the guilt of his actions. It didn't take long for the story of the tragic accident to morph into something far more sinister. Within weeks, locals began reporting sightings of a ghostly apparition on the bridge. The stories varied, but the central theme remained the same: the ghost of Sarah, haunting the bridge where she had met her tragic end. Witnesses claimed that on dark, foggy nights, a spectral Jeep would appear out of nowhere, speeding towards them with its headlights glaring. Those who had the misfortune of encountering the ghostly vehicle described a chilling sensation of being chased by something unseen. Many reported the sensation of the Jeep closing in on them, the headlights growing brighter until they had to flee in terror to avoid a collision. The local newspaper picked up the story, and soon the haunted bridge of Ravens Creek became a topic of widespread interest. The accounts of terrified drivers and the ghostly Jeep became a regular feature in the local news. Police reports documented numerous calls from frightened drivers who had witnessed the ghostly apparition, describing it in varying degrees of detail, but always with the same sense of dread. As the reports of the ghostly Jeep continued, the town council decided to take action. Fearing for the safety of both the curious and the unsuspecting, they decided to close the bridge permanently. Large, ominous signs were erected at both ends of the bridge, reading, "Bridge closed," in bold black letters. Heavy-duty locks and chains were affixed to prevent anyone from attempting to cross. The bridge, now a ghostly relic of its former self, stood silent and abandoned. It became a point of fascination for those who heard the stories and wanted to see the bridge for themselves. The eerie atmosphere surrounding the area only added to the intrigue. The nearby house, located at the corner of the road leading to the bridge, became a focal point for those seeking to experience the supernatural. The house, a quaint but old-fashioned building, was owned by the Johnson family. They had been approached multiple times by curious individuals wanting to buy the property, but the Johnsons had always refused to sell. The house had become a symbol of the town's ghostly lore, with many visitors coming to witness the bridge and the spooky atmosphere firsthand. They would often run to the Johnson house for cover, calling the police from the safety of the porch. The Johnsons had adapted to their new role as keepers of the legend. They had even installed a second driveway to avoid the road leading to the now closed bridge, a precaution that only added to the house's mysterious allure. Years passed, but the legend of the haunted bridge of Ravens Creek endured. New generations of locals grew up hearing the tale, and the bridge remained a point of curiosity and fear. Some believed the ghost of Sarah was still out there, waiting to be seen by those brave enough to venture close. As for Tom, the driver, he lived out his days burdened by the weight of his actions. The guilt and the knowledge of what had happened on that fateful night haunted him until the end of his life. To this day, the story of the haunted bridge of Ravens Creek continues to capture the imaginations of those who hear it. The bridge may be closed, but the legend lives on, a reminder of the tragic events that unfolded and the ghostly presence that is said to linger there, waiting for its next encounter with the living.